Здравствуйте. Welcome to the Triage Method podcast with me, Gary McGowan, and my co-host, Mr. Patrick Farrell. Как дела? Sugodny, Patrick.
I am absolutely fantastic, Gary. This is not a Russian broadcast. This is still in English. And we might change this Oskalga sometime, but as of right now, it's in English. But Gary, what are we talking about today? And how's life for you?
This is a broadcast from Soviet radio in Leningrad. Life is good. I can't complain. Well, actually, I can complain because it's absolutely bucketing down outside. So it is here in Cork.
Sunny here, but anyway.
Actually, lovely and dry and sunny this morning, and I was looking forward to that. But yeah, such is life. It is Friday as we record this. Got that Friday feeling, as my man Mufasa says. And this week we're going to be talking about a continuation topic from the fat loss discussions that we've been having. And in particular, what we're going to discuss is the fact that the feeling or experience that comes from the process of fat loss or being in a calorie deficit is not for life. And this is a really important thing to get, because one of the things that you will hear discussed most often, and we've discussed it, is that fat loss and the process of pursuing fat loss, particularly if you do so in a more aggressive manner, comes with a number of trade-offs, both physiological and psychological, as well as social effects and beyond. Where if you are eating less food, for example, you're not going to be able to engage socially as much. If you're eating less food, you're not going to have as much energy for training. If you're eating less food, you are going to be hungry. You're going to have more cravings. You might struggle psychologically with that, etc., etc. But that is not what is required long term, because ultimately there is an end point, and there's going to be multiple pit stops potentially along the way. And if you have the foresight to be able to realize that, oh, this is going to change in future and this is temporary, that makes that process a lot more tolerable. And a parallel example would be when someone is pursuing a longer term career path, for example, in medicine or law or various other fields, there's often an intensive period, not only during the education process where you're at university, but after that, postgraduate, where you're basically at the bottom of the food chain. You have to do a lot of additional exams, a lot of additional accreditation, and it's kind of accepted as part of that career pathway that the first few years will suck. That you're at the bottom of the food chain, you're not being reimbursed particularly well, you don't have much time for social activities, relationships, etc., because you're working so much. But the realization is that this is worth it. This is tolerable, because 5-10 years down the line, I'll eventually be able to step back a little bit less. I'll have a little bit more autonomy, responsibility, payment, depending on the field. And all of that makes that tolerable. If someone was in that position where, they were, let's say, in their second year of medical training after graduating, and they were working as much as they are, being paid as much as they are, being treated as they are, they probably, if they were thinking that this was for life and this is never going to change for the next 40-50 years as I work, that would probably be intolerable for a lot of people, and you'd have a much higher dropout rate, although it's already quite high. And that's ultimately what you need to think about when it comes to fat loss as well, is that many people think that fat loss, weight loss is not going to be achievable for me because this experience is something I just can't sustain. But the reality is that if you have 10 kilos to lose, let's say, and then you're going to be happy at that body weight, you're healthy at that body weight, then what you have to realize is that if you lose that 10 kilos, let's say over 10, 15, 20 weeks, even a year, that's your investment. And that's it, potentially, that you can go back to maintenance, that you can increase your calories, that you can return to a more normal or satisfactory way of eating. And, that's just a really important thing to grasp. And that's why we want to emphasize it in this podcast.
Yeah. And this is so important, because as soon as you actually understand this, right? And I mean, actually understand it, not just in oh, those are good words. Yeah, they make sense. I mean, understand this in terms of as it applies to you in your fat loss phases. If you can go from having that short term, oh, this is what I'm going to do over the next 6, 8, 10, 12 weeks, whatever it is, you can go from having that short-term focus and focusing entirely on like, oh, this is what fat loss feels like. Oh, I feel crap. I feel like I have low energy, et cetera, like the things that go along with that. And then you actually think of the long term in terms of like, what are you actually moving towards? Where are you actually going with all of this stuff? Like, where do you want to be in a year's time? Like, let's go 6 months time, a year's time, 2 years time, 5 years, 10 years time. Like, where do you want to be with all this stuff? It first of all actually makes the process easier because you actually start employing methods that are far more in line with what you actually want to achieve, rather than focusing purely on the like, oh, I'm going to go on this 1,000-calorie diet, and it's like, oh, I'm going to try get as much fat loss as humanly possible before I burn out, and invariably, like, that's not how people do successful fat loss diets, because they do that 1,000-calorie diet and then they stick to that for 2 weeks. And then all of a sudden they have 30,000 calories over a weekend. They feel like shit. They feel guilty. They feel like crap, blah, blah, blah. Then they're like, all right, I can't start the diet. I've been binging since Friday and it's now Thursday, or it's now fucking Wednesday. So I'll start next Monday. So, like stuff like that happens. And obviously you don't get results that way, So having this longer term focus actually makes the process so much smoother, because you don't do stupid things like that. You actually diet correctly, right? Or you go out and learn about how to diet correctly. You say you get coaching from people like us, for example, or you listen to podcasts like this, or you actually go about the process in a much more beneficial way long term, right? However, one of the things that, and Gary just noted it there, one of the things that really makes this hard to know exactly what to do is that, like, you could be on a fat loss phase, you could be on a fat loss diet and be like, right, I want to lose 10 kilos, we'll say. So, not a huge amount, but a fairly significant amount as well, right? You want to lose those 10 kilos and you're like, right, that's what I need to do. That's the kind of goal with all of this, right? You can be in a position where you could be on track with that. You're like, all right, I'm losing a kilo, 2 kilos, 3 kilos. You're moving on, you're moving forward with that stuff, right? And if you focus purely on, oh, what I feel like right now, that's what I'm going to feel like forever. If that's what you focus on, like, you're probably not going to actually finish that diet. You're probably not going to be successful long-term with that diet, because generally eating less food is not enjoyable. No one really likes that. And okay, maybe you get over the physiological stuff. Maybe it's not, hunger is not getting you because, you've been really like, oh, I get a load of veggies in, even with like the water that I drink, like in between meals, I'm adding like, psyllium husk to it. So I get more fiber. I feel fuller, stuff like that. Like, there's loads of little hacks and tricks and whatever else that you can potentially use to feel a little bit fuller and, less hungry on a diet. Maybe you just, normally you just don't feel that, it's like the physiological hunger response is not that high for you. It's not like something that's going to derail you from the diet, maybe you notice you've low energy, maybe you don't notice you've low energy, like, there's going to be different things that you're going to experience on the diet. Maybe your thinking is a little bit different in terms of, like, some people find that they have a negative thought process when dieting. Like, they're just like, oh, like, I shouldn't do that, or they're just very negative in their thoughts. Whereas when they're eating more, they're like very positive. I feel great, like everything, life is good, etc. Right? Again, that's potentially experiences that you're going to have while you're dieting. But also, and this is probably the main deciding factor, the biggest factor for the vast majority of people, and that is, when you're dieting, like, socializing becomes very hard, right? Like, I can pretty much fucking tell you right now, about 50% of my clients, and I could say without even having asked Gary, about 50% of his clients right now that are dieting, they're probably struggling with the fact that the world is reopening. It's like, oh, shops are open, restaurants are kind of open, like, obviously still dine outside, but they're opening up. There's more going on. People are having barbecues, people are having like food in their houses, like there's more going on. And as a result of that, people don't want to be in a fat loss phase, even though they might still want to get fat loss, So if you focus entirely on like, oh, I am really restricted in terms of what I can actually do on this fat loss phase, I don't actually want to be lean anymore. I don't want to be lean ever, because you think that that's what it's going to be like for the rest of your life. When in reality, that's not really the case. Like, once you get to the level of leanness that you want to be at, you've got the fat loss that you want. The longer term with this stuff is, you actually get to eat more calories, not maybe more than you previously ate, that led to, the fat accumulation, but you get to eat more calories than what you dieted on, right? And that is something that you really like. need to get into your head that like what you eat for fat loss is not the same in terms of, you know, the magnitude, in terms of calories and stuff. What you eat for fat loss is not the same as what you eat for long-term maintenance, you know? So that is something that you really need to get into your head and actually internalize rather than just thinking they're good words. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's along with that, I think that one one hindrance of the diet process is that when you are dieting for a long period of time, your hunger and your appetite and those signals and the circuitry responsible for that become a bit dysregulated. So if you were to, let's say someone is dieting on 2200 calories, their maintenance is around 2800 calories. If they have a single day or even a week at 2800 calories, it still doesn't feel like that much to them, because they've got this accumulated diet fatigue, so to speak, and they've got these cravings and they've got increased hunger and appetite, and they still don't feel fulfilled when they bump up to 2800 calories, despite having been on 2200 previously. And that's especially the case if someone has lost a lot of weight, and particularly at very low levels of body fat. But the thing to understand there is that the longer that you maintain that level of maintenance, the more those systems begin to normalize once again. Okay, so they become a bit more regulated. So you get greater concordance between how hungry you are and your true energy needs. Whereas when you're dieting, there's significant discordance there, where if you could probably consume 3,500 calories at a maintenance of 2,800 and still be hungry, 4,000, you could still be hungry potentially. But if you were to do that every single day, you'd be pretty full, and you'd eventually get to the point where you're not really that interested in food anymore. The food focus begins to diminish. And that's what we tend to see with people coming out of diets. And it's one of the reasons that I tend to be pretty keen, and we tend to be pretty keen, I think, on getting people back to maintenance rather than adopting a very slow reverse diet process. Because you will see some people do this where they might have, been in an aggressive diet where they were, in a deficit of 500 calories, and then they add 50 calories per week. So they're still in a deficit for 10 additional weeks, and it takes them 10 weeks to get back to maintenance. And despite the fact that they've been increasing their calories, they've actually prolonged that period in an energy deficit and not giving themselves the chance to recover that concordance between hunger and energy needs. So that's something that's really
Which,
important.
just as an aside, like that can be a perfectly fine approach if you want to basically keep dieting while you slowly
exactly.
increase your calories. Like if you're like, I have 10 more weeks of dieting to do, maybe you have like 5 more weeks of dieting to do, but you're like, my event that I want to get lean for is 10 weeks away. You're like, okay, well, let's start actually slowly increasing calories in the lead up to that. It's like, we're still in a deficit, so great. But we've got a little bit more energy to play with now. 50 calories is, kind of fuck all, but at the same time, it is a slight bit more than what you previously were on. So like we're not bashing that approach. It's just, that is still a deficit approach. That is still a fat loss approach, it's not a get to maintenance approach. And this is just what Gary was saying there. Like, this is so weird in terms of, like, if you experience this, you'll know exactly what we're talking about. Like, if you've never experienced this, you kind of go like what? I don't really grasp it. But if you've ever been in a deficit, like, you'll know, you go back up to what you think is maintenance, and all of a sudden you're like, why am I still hungry? Like, this is supposed to be maintenance. And then you can start thinking like, oh, I'm actually just going to be hungry for the rest of my life. This is me now, So fuck this. I'm just going to eat whatever the fuck I want because, I'm hungry all the time, right? And this is why, like, I would argue that the maintenance phase, like, we were, pretty big on, doing maintenance phases. Obviously depends on the client, depends on the situation, but I think a maintenance phase makes sense for a lot of people. Like, actually diving into a diet that is set up to just maintain your weight. Like, we're still progressing with the training. Like, I always call it gaintaining, where it's like, we're focusing on progress wherever we can get it, but the diet is actually just set up to, like, maintain weight, right? But it's so important to go through that phase, especially after a diet. And like some people can do it in 2 weeks, some people can do it in 8 weeks, some people can do it in 12 weeks. Some people it takes a lot longer. It depends on the level of leanness, depends on the history, etc. But having a phase after a diet phase where you're actually focused on just maintaining weight is actually so important, because it actually allows those hunger signals to become realigned. Because if you don't do this and you focus on like, oh, I'm just going to gain weight or whatever, you can end up in a situation where your hunger actually far outstrips your actual need. Like if you just, like you see people go like, oh, I finished my fat loss phase, I'm going to go into like an intuitive eating style of dieting. Like it's probably the worst time to do it, because if you try to listen to your hunger signals, those hunger signals are just going, feed me all the time. Just like, give me food, I need food all of the fucking time, because you've just been dieting for however many weeks, Whereas if you've done an actual maintenance phase, let's say 4 weeks of that, you actually get back to a stage where you're like, oh, I'm actually quite hungry. Like say, for example, I know my maintenance is in and around 2,750. I guess in and around where I need to be for maintenance right now, based on my lifestyle and training demands, etc. And I know, I was dieting previously a couple of weeks ago on like 2,200, right? 2,250, something like that, right? And for me, I was like, I'm relatively hungry on that. It's more so the socializing and like being able to eat dinner or whatever with my girlfriend. It's like that those kind of things become hard. So I was like, I'm kind of happy with my physique now. I'm happy with fat loss. I'm going to end it, right? And then I went up to like, again, what I thought was maintenance. And first few weeks, I was like, I'm still kind of hungry on this. And now at the stage, I'm like, I'm eating the exact same amount. And I'm like, man, I'm actually stuffed. Like I'm struggling to get the food in, even though I'm eating the same amount. And like my body hasn't changed. Like I've gained like, half a kilo in that time frame, like in the last however many weeks. And like most of that was in the first 2 weeks. It's like as your body gets glycogen, water, etc. Right. So that is something to be really, really aware of. And that's more of a feeling than a physiological thing. Like obviously it is, we can explain it physiologically in terms of like the signaling that's going on. Like there is some lag time with this stuff. However, it is a feeling that we're discussing, right? And this is really important, because how you feel on the deficit, like that does have some carry over in terms of how you then feel when you are eating at maintenance. And that can lead a lot of people to basically quit the diet because they feel like, oh, well, I'm going to feel hungry all the time. I might as well just fucking give up with all this stuff, When in reality, it's like, there is some lag time here, and that hunger will dissipate as you spend longer and longer eating at maintenance. And it is actually the exact same, but opposite when you're in a gaining phase or a bulking phase or whatever fuck you want to call it, in terms of like your hunger, like you won't feel hungry. Like say you get to the end of your bulking phase, you've done that for the last 2 years, you've just been overeating, and you're like, right, I'm pretty happy with the muscle that I've built, I want to see what's underneath this. And then you go into a deficit, like out the gate, like you could go into like 1,000-calorie deficit and you'd be like, not really that hungry, because you've just spent the last 2 years over consuming, right? So there is some lag time in terms of when that hunger starts picking up again. And that is important to understand, because I'm telling you, from years of experience with this stuff, most people find that transition time in terms of going from a fat loss phase into a maintenance phase difficult, not because of any of the demands or the physiological stuff, more so for we'll call it psychological stuff, in terms of like actually managing those feelings that occur and how they then perceive and analyze those feelings.
Yes, sir. I agree with everything that has been uttered from the mouth of Mr. Patrick Farrell. So I think that the key point here that you need to get is to have some sort of exit plan in advance. It doesn't need to be something that you actually stick to rigidly, but that you have some idea of where does the diet stop? How am I going to approach it when I end the diet, in terms of, for example, removing cardio or increasing calories, etc. And one of the biggest problems is that people just don't have any exit plan.
People don't have any plan, full stop. They basically
any plan,
like,
full stop.
I want to be like dieting forever. That's the plan. It's like, this is not a good plan, because then you're just going to have those bad feelings forever and never get the good feelings.
Exactly. And I mean, there's a few different things that are important there, because what happens when people exit a diet typically is they'll stop doing all the cardio they used to do. They'll start training in a different way. They'll start not only eating far more, but also eating different foods. And this is one of the key things I want to emphasize for the purpose of this podcast, is that like it's not just about the change in calories after a diet. It's also about the changes in food, because what people often do when they're dieting is that they'll begin to, adopt a diet that's typically cleaner, so to speak. So more vegetables, more lean meats. They're typically looking for foods that are higher in volume, that are going to keep them more full. They might be using strategies, like you said, Patty, like psyllium husk between meals, trying to eat more fiber, etc., etc. Everything is effectively trying to manage hunger and maximize fullness on that level of calories. And what people look forward to then is no longer using those strategies. So not only do they come out of a diet and, let's say, add 500 calories, but they also swap their all those strategies out in place of more calorie dense foods, more normal foods, maybe eating out more, etc. And all of that then leads to basically an even higher tendency to want to overeat, because you've already got some, dysregulated hunger / appetite signals, and you're now feeding that with hyperpalatable foods into effectively what is a hypersensitive system to those stimuli, because that is what position you're in when you finish a diet. You're very sensitive to, sweetness, the mouth feel of like fattier foods like chocolate, etc. It's all amazing to you because you've been deprived of those, but secondly, you also are in an energy deficit, or you have been in an energy deficit. So everything is primed to make you want to overeat. So when you're coming up with that exit plan, you need to make sure that if you are changing calories, that you're not also massively changing the food types that you're consuming. You can to some degree. For example, you might have previously been having porridge with water, let's say, in the morning. And now you're swapping back to porridge with milk because, you find it tastier. You could probably eat a little bit more of it, but you're not going, right, porridge is out, time to have, I don't know, Cocoa Pops for breakfast. It's totally different in terms of how full you're going to be in response to that, the fiber content, the palatability, etc. So don't change too many things at once, or else that exit plan might be a little bit more difficult to execute,
100%. And like, I think for most people, the biggest win is going to actually have a timeline, in
Yes.
terms of like, because most people I say you don't have a timeline, but most people do have a timeline in terms of they're like, oh yeah, I have 16 weeks or however long until this event that I want to be leaner for, whatever, right? And then there's no actual timeline at the back end of that. It's like, I'm either dieting or I'm not dieting, right? And like, I'm hopefully people who have been listening to the podcast have become aware that we're pretty big on like actually creating a sustainable diet model, like something that you're actually going to be able to do for the rest of your life potentially. And obviously that means building up good habits in terms of like, healthy food habits. And that is not going to be something you can do if you don't actually have a timeline in terms of like, what are you going to do after the event? Like what's going to keep you focused on the diet? What's going to keep you focused on your training? Because this often happens, like you have this post diet, like malaise, we'll call it, where you're like, oh, I don't, my direction, like what am I aiming towards? I don't know. Like what's the goal? I don't know. Like you can be very wishy-washy with everything because you don't have that solid, oh, this is exactly the timeline that we're following in terms of I was on a dieting phase, now I'm on a maintenance phase, then I want to go to a gaining phase or whatever, or like this is what I'm doing with my training in the lead up to this, and then this is what we're changing it to after this, whatever. You have to have a plan of action for all of that stuff, because otherwise you basically just get left at the whim of your feelings, which again, they can be so all over the place, and it's not actually true. It's not actually a true reflection of what's actually going on, because you're dealing with this diet fatigue. You're dealing with the fact that, again, you've been dieting for the last 12 weeks and you're like, your body is just calling out for food. And in reality, you would have been happily delighted if you could eat 3,000 calories for the rest of your life and maintain this level of leanness. But in the moment, you were like, oh no, fuck this. I'm still hungry on 3,000 calories, even though it was actually maintenance. I'm just going to, a load of cheat meals, a load of like, cheat foods. And I'm using these cheat words because that's what people often use. Like they're like, oh, I just blew the diet, and then they gain back 5 kilos and they're like, oh, I'm unhappy with that now. And then they go into this, oh, I'm actually just going to start dieting again. Even though their previous diet just ended 6 to 8 weeks ago, they've gained back 5 kilos, even though they were quote unquote eating at maintenance, which they weren't eating at because they were eating all these extra foods, these, hyper palatable foods, etc., into the diet. And now they've done like this 6 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks, however long, of like kind of semi-maintenance, mostly in this kind of surplus, but they still haven't actually recovered those normal hunger signals. And now they're going back into a deficit. And then they're like, oh, like I'm gonna start dieting again, and I'm in this 1,000 calorie deficit or 500 calorie or whatever it is, and now all of a sudden they're extra hungry because they've never actually recovered those normal hunger signals. So like this stuff is important to do longer term, but the main thing you need to realize is that it is important to understand that how you feel on a diet is not how you're going to feel for the rest of your life. And then you actually have to pay attention to these feelings in terms of like the signals your body is giving you, but also you have to ignore them to some extent, right? In terms of like they are lying to you sometimes, right? And this is part of the process of understanding how to get long-term results. It's knowing when to listen to them, being like, okay, we're excessively hungry right now, we shouldn't be dieting, right? Or again, we're still hungry, but we're actually eating at maintenance, and it's going to be a case of we just need to give this a little bit of time before we start feeling great. Like I had a client like this summer, like he was like, right, I want to get really, really lean. We were getting him really lean. Now it was impacting on his social life, because he's in England, so they're opening up a bit more faster, shall we say, or a bit faster, not a bit more faster, a bit faster than Ireland is. But they were opening up, and social life was being impacted. But he was like, right, it's actually worth the trade-off because I want to get lean. He's like, I'm the leanest I've ever been. I'm really seeing the six-pack come on, et cetera, right? But then he was feeling like at a certain stage, he was like, right, it's impacting my social life quite a bit, and I'm at a stage where my energy is too low for what I want to do, and I'm hungry more and more, right? More and more of the time, right? So it's like for him, the trade-off becomes it's not worth it, right? We brought calories back up to in and around maintenance, and like I kid you not, within a week he's like, man, I feel fucking great. Like we probably could have continued that diet phase on. Maybe I was just like too like in the wrong mental headspace, etc. And it's like, yeah, like this is the kind of thing that happens all the time. And it's purely related to the amount of calories that we're on, and like I could have, for him, I could have been like, right, no, we're actually going to push through for the next 2 weeks and blah, 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 or whatever, get him to like this shredded lean stage. But realistically, he was lean enough where he was. We didn't need to do that, like it was only kind of that like, oh, let's get actually ridiculously lean. There was no actual end goal for it overall. But I know already, again, 2 weeks past the point, then he's like, man, feel fantastic. Energy level is in a great place. Hunger level is in a great place. I have way more ability to like socialize, et cetera, et cetera. And like, you don't think of those things when you're actually planning out your diet, and you really just focus on the current here and now. Like if you're coaching yourself, like we would have got him, say that level of leanness that we got him to, like him coaching himself probably would have stopped 6 weeks before that. He would have been like, oh, you're already I'm feeling the hunger a little bit too much, or it's impacting my socializing a bit too much, etc. Right? And then he never actually gets to that level of leanness. And then it's again, this constant battle up and back, because, he's like, oh, I wanted to be leaner, but now I'm kind of in this maintenance phase or this kind of semi-gaining phase. And now I'm like, oh, I did that for again 6 to 8 weeks. And now I'm going to go back into a deficit phase. And, it's like, it just becomes so muddied, and you never actually achieve your results, the results that you want. And this is why, well, one of the many, many reasons why people say like, oh, fat loss phases are so hard. And it comes down to the fact that, first of all, like obviously being in a deficit is, challenging enough. Again, it impacts on your life in terms of hunger, in terms of like the physiology stuff, but also then the psychology and the social aspect of things. But also, most people don't actually have a fucking timeline. They don't have a timeline of like, this is what I'm going to do for the next 16 weeks. And then afterwards, this is the plan of action to sustain the results, in terms of I want to actually keep the results or relatively close to the results that I got for the rest of my life, or potentially for however many months, whatever you want to do, and longer term. Like you have to have a plan of action for that. And like we're calling it an exit strategy from a fat loss phase, but it's just a strategy for the rest of your life. And again, like I'm not saying you have to plan out everything fastidiously and be really anal with everything and be like, right, no, I need to have like every microgram of everything recorded, etc. I'm not saying that. There should just be like broad strokes in terms of like, this is in and around where I'm probably going to be at during this time frame. This is what I'm going to do with these different aspects of it. So definitely have a timeline with the stuff. And in that timeline, don't just go, all right, it's 16 weeks that I want to diet for, however many weeks or whatever it is for you. And then I'm done, and there's no timeline out the back end of that. No, you need to have a timeline that extends 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months out the back end of that fat loss phase, if it is something that you actually want to sustain for the rest of your life. Does that make sense, Gary?
It absolutely does. Sorry, there's a plane going overhead there. Don't know if you can hear it. Probably can't.
No, I can't.
You love to hear the planes back in the sky. But yes, no, I think the exit strategy, look, it's essential. The further in advance you have that exit strategy, the more you can rest assured that your diet will be successful, because it means that when you are having those moments where, you're struggling a bit, that it's not permanent. That's really important. And have the end point, even if it's just rough, because this is something I always ask clients, where we might be like 8 to 12 weeks in and they're really on track with regards to fat loss. And I say to them, where's the end for you? And they might be doing better than they thought. That's often the case. They're getting fat loss results much quicker than they expected. And then they're thinking, oh, maybe I'll take this a lot further than I thought. Maybe I'll try lose another 10 kilos or something like that. And you don't want to bite off too much initially. That's another thing, is that, like, set a target and then stick with it. And when you get there, take a little break for a while. It might be that you spend a month at maintenance, or you spend 2 months at maintenance, and you focus on your performance. And then you say, right, that actually wasn't so bad. I feel like my appetite is re-regulated. I have good energy levels. I feel prepared psychologically to engage with the diet again. So why don't we go for another 5 kilos? And then that you set that target and you try to stick with it, because what you don't want to end up in, and this is what happens with many people, often long before they get to the point of working with us, is people end up in this perma diet, that they got into fitness with the intent of losing weight. And that could be genuinely up to 10, if not more years, that they've been trying to do that in some way. And, every second month they're dieting. But when they're not dieting, it's not intentional. It's more so just, oh, I fell off track. So it's not like I'm deliberately at maintenance or deliberately in a surplus and I'm deliberately trying to improve performance, but rather it's just like, oh, the diet wasn't going so great, so I ended up maintaining or gaining weight. So now I'm dieting again. And you're just in that perma diet phase for years and years and years. So if you can set yourself that target of saying, right, over the next 12 weeks, I'm going to aim to lose 5 kilos and then I'm going to take a break. That's so much better than saying, all right, I want to lose 5 kilos. I'm dieting now, but, I'll see how it goes, because very often, especially if you're guiding things yourself, you can just end up giving yourself a week's break here and there, or things slip by and you're not tracking anymore and you're not following your goals. And it just becomes really messy and can extend indefinitely. And we've seen that many times.
Yeah, it's such a hard thing to get out of yourself, because you don't have the knowledge or the thought processes to get out of it. You're just like, oh, how am I going to fix this? Oh, I'll do another diet phase. And it's like this is the thought process that got you here. But it is a hard thing to deal with. But I think from that, again, like, this is more of a practical episode. I think people are pretty well aware from that it's probably important to have a timeline. It's probably important to realize that the feelings on a diet are not the feelings that you're going to have long term, and they are going to change. So you have to master that art of listening to your feelings when you're dieting, in terms of, maybe it is right to cut it short, but then also not overly listening to them when it's like you've actually changed some things and there is some lag time with, say, hunger, for example. But two things that I want to touch on, just to kind of round out this discussion, is that people will use to try to trick this stuff in terms of, like, make the dieting feel better or feel easier, or move into a maintenance phase or whatever. Like, they will use stuff like refeeds, right? And like, we're pro refeeds. Like, they can be great for a number of reasons. We can use a 1-day refeed, for example, to restock glycogen a little bit. So performance the next week is going to be increased. I sometimes do this with like GAA athletes or something, or, field sport athletes, where it's like, we want to be in a diet phase, but you have important games every Saturday or every Sunday. So we're actually just going to do a strategic, you could call it a carb load if you will, but we're just going to do a strategic, diet break or a refeed for that one day beforehand, so you have a bit more glycogen in the system, but it's kind of factored into the overall week, etc. Right? And so you can definitely use them. They're beneficial. However, for refeeds to be effective for most of the stuff that we're talking about, they're probably going to have to be 3 days or more, and ideally I would say 7 days, in terms of like, we'll call it resetting some of these signals that are going on in terms of like hunger, in terms of like neuroendocrine signaling. Like, it's probably going to require 3 to 7 days, and even that, is that going to fully reset it back to where we want it to be? Probably not realistically, but it at least gives you a little bump from where you were previously. However, we're probably not a huge advocate of refeeding. We're probably just a bigger advocate of having diet breaks built into the system. Now, again, you can do this 2 ways. You can have it like proactively being like, right, we're going to diet for 12 weeks. We're going to have a diet break then after that. And then we're going to, reassess, or maybe we diet for another 6 weeks, 12 weeks, whatever it is. Right. And that's definitely one way to do it. Again, we'll say a week to 2 weeks of a diet break, sometimes up to a month. It depends. And in that diet break, we're having, we're eating roughly maintenance calories. Right. And we could also use we'll call it an as needed diet break, in terms of, some people have stuff going on in their life. It's like a particularly stressful week, or, they just need, they're traveling a bit more, or they're socializing a bit more, or whatever it is. And in those cases, again, we could just have a diet break, especially if we know this stuff is coming up. It's so much easier to plan around that. Like, I'll often do that with clients. I'll be like, right, write down, map out all the stuff that you have coming up: birthdays, special occasions, christenings, whatever the fuck it is. It's like, let's actually just map all those things out, so we're like, we know what's coming up and what's likely to derail the process, so we can actually plan for that and accommodate that stuff. So there's 2 ways you can use those kind of diet breaks, but either way, like, they are such a beneficial strategy to help you actually succeed long term. It's kind of like that, taking a step back to take 2 steps forward, and people are very hesitant to do this, because they're very much like, oh fuck no, if I go on a diet break, I'm going to lose all my gains. I'm not like, I'm going to lose all my fat loss results, and I'm just going to gain a load of fat. But again, it's basically giving you practice for what you want to do long term. Right? It gives you a little glimpse of that, because you ideally want to be eating at maintenance long term. Presumably you want to maintain the results that you've gotten. That's what most people want to do. They don't want to just lose 10 kilos and then gain 10 kilos back. Very few people want to do that. So it gives you a little glimpse of how that's going to look, what that's going to feel like, how you're going to perform during that time period, all that kind of stuff. It gives you a little bit of a glimpse into that. Now, it doesn't give you the full story, because as we said earlier on, you probably still do have a little bit of like dysregulated hunger. You probably do feel a little bit like lower energy, etc. Right? But again, it gives you that glimpse into that the world that you want to travel to. Right? But one of the things that also goes along with that is, and people they basically categorize all of these things together. They go from cheat meals, which we'll touch on in a second, to refeeds, to diet breaks, right? And like, as I said, like, we're way more of an advocate of a diet break, and then refeeds, they have their place. They can be strategically used. But these kind of cheat meals that people use, like, they're just more harm than good, right? In terms of, it doesn't really actually help the process, because you're not getting any of the like physiological boost in terms of like having extra calories for 3 to 5 to 7 days. So you're not getting that unless you basically just eat at maintenance for the week. Most people end up having this poor relationship with food as a result of utilizing cheat meals as well, which is obviously not ideal. And again, going back to the feelings, which is what this episode is about, you might momentarily feel, oh yeah, that's great, like the taste of this, huge greasy burger or whatever, it's fantastic, I really needed this to, like, psychologically help me with the diet. Like, that's fair enough. But what often happens is there's a lot of guilt, shame, feelings of, negative feelings, we'll call them, that happen after that. And usually it takes people 2 or 3 days to kind of feel like they're back in a rhythm after having that. And then, most people are like, oh, I'm having a cheat meal every single week. So they're basically, after 3 to 5 days of, feeling the guilt, shame, or whatever for the last cheat meal, they're back to another cheat meal, So it's like, this is not great strategy overall. And also, it doesn't actually cure any of the things that we want to cure. Like you still feel like crap on a diet, and it probably makes your diet extended. You probably have to diet for longer now as a result of including these cheat meals, so you feel like crap for longer, right? So again, you're shooting yourself in the foot with this and not really getting any benefit, apart from obviously like, getting to have a juicy meal, whatever, a tasty meal. But it's momentary, it's fleeting, it's like this is not beneficial for your long-term goals.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. But anyway, Gary, do you have anything else to say on that in terms of like
No.
elaborating on how people feel on a diet being different to how they feel on a maintenance phase
No,
or
I think I
long
think
term?
I think we covered most of what's required. The only final thing is more of a peripheral point, and it's related to training, and that is people often um justify or rationalize training practices in a diet that they wouldn't necessarily justify if they were in a surplus. The classic example of this is when someone starts to diet, they might notice that they don't have as much energy or their strength is dropping a touch. So, what they'll do is rather than dealing with the reality of that, for example, by maybe not dieting as aggressively or modifying their programming, etc., they'll often just, take a sidestep and just focus on more hypertrophy or pump focused training. So for example, feeling their muscles work and getting a good pump in the gym so that it's kind of in line with their aesthetic goals. It's not necessarily about the outcome from the training, but rather how they feel during the session. And then when they're in the surplus, they take advantage of the fact that, oh, I do feel stronger, I have more energy, so I'm going to do a load of strength work and maybe not take care of the hypertrophy work that might allow them to have more muscle if they were dieting again. So those things can happen very easily. And I think that one of the things that makes that relevant to this discussion is that when you're coming out of that dieting phase, or when you're in the dieting phase, remember your overall training goal, and that training goal doesn't necessarily need to change because you have a different level of calories. You can still keep training for strength, you can still keep training for performance while in a deficit. You just might have to modify your expectations for those outcomes, because what you don't want is that because you've got lower energy levels, let's say, or poorer recovery potentially on a diet, is that you totally change the way that you train just because it's kind of going along with how you're feeling, because that is what often happens. And then people are left when they're in a surplus kind of starting again, from a baseline that is less than where they started with their diet. And as a result, you're playing catch up every time you do end up in a surplus then. And then another obvious example of that, or relevant point related to that, would be the fact that people adopt so much cardio and so much calorie intensive training when they're dieting, because they're trying to just now view training through the lens of energy expenditure as opposed to having a defined training outcome. So don't get sidetracked by those things. They're short-term outcomes from training, and ultimately if you're focused on the long term, you need to keep that in the program at all times.
100%, Gary. I couldn't agree with you more. And this is especially true with cardio. Like obviously you can see it with strength training and like we'll call it resistance training overall. And like people are very wishy-washy with the goals. Once the diet kicks in and the calories are not there to support this feeling of like the Incredible Hulk in the gym, all of a sudden they're like, oh, fuck it. Like, yeah, I'm just going to completely change up my training, maybe swap out exercises that are getting challenging, rather than like, even though they're really effective exercises for them, they're like, oh, I can't lift the same amount, so I'll just switch to this other thing. It's like people do all this kind of stuff, but you definitely see this in the realm of like cardio and conditioning overall. People are like, oh yeah, when I'm dieting, like, oh, I'm stay on top of all my aerobic training, my anaerobic training. I'll do like, sprints after my workouts, and then I'll do cardio sessions, 30, 40, 50, 60 minutes, whatever, cardio sessions as well, just to burn calories. And it's like, this is probably the worst time in terms of actually getting these cardiovascular adaptations that we, want. Now, it's not to say that you can't get them. That's far from the truth. But if we actually wanted to support those cardiovascular adaptations, doing that kind of level of training when you were actually well fueled probably makes far more sense. Like if you're like, oh, I actually want to get really, really fit, like then actually fuel that cardio. That's how you would do it. If you were to go like, oh, I'm a Tour de France athlete and I want to, be the best, you wouldn't be like calorie deficit. That's what's going to do it. Now you'd be like, we need to fuel this training, right? So why would you be any different in terms of you're just not a Tour de France athlete, but you want to improve your conditioning, and that is something that, again, it comes back to that long-term like strategic planning, having a timeline with all this stuff. Because if you want to improve your fitness, your cardiovascular system, your health, etc., like you want to be doing these things at different stages. And like, yeah, it does make sense to do cardio while you're dieting because it helps with a cardio or a calorie deficit. Fantastic. We're all for that. Again, if it fits your goals, etc. Right. But also, if we actually want to build those adaptations, like we want to do it when we actually have fuel. And also it's going to make, consecutive diets down the line or whatever easier, because if we're able to improve our cardio conditioning, while we actually have the fuel to do it, and we actually have this as part of our day and part of our schedule, etc., so much easier to keep that going forward, right? So that's something to be considerate of in terms of like what is the best way to fuel your training? What is the best way to organize your training on the longer term? And again, I know people are like, oh, well, all I care about right now is this fat loss phase that I'm in. And that's just it's not beneficial long term. It's like, what are we doing after this? Are we actually setting ourselves up correctly for, again, a sustainable health, fitness, diet practice long term, rather than just prioritizing the next 8 weeks or 16 weeks or however long the diet phase is? Like, what are we setting up long term? What are we actually creating with all of this stuff? And is it actually what you want long term? Anyway, Gary, I don't have much else to say unless you have something to say now that your screen has gone completely black and
we'll be back in a second.
dropped out, but yeah, I don't really have much else to say. Like, I think people understand now that it is very much a case of like, you have to learn how to listen to your feelings with this stuff. And I want people to go away from this podcast and understand, like, whether they're dieting themselves or they coach others for fat loss. Like, I want them to go away from this and understand that how you feel on a diet, how you feel when you're eating less calories, is not how you're going to feel long-term with this stuff. And you have to come up with a plan of action to deal with the transitionary period between the diet phase and then the maintenance phase, but then also like having this long-term strategic plan for where you want to go with everything. It really does make sense, and it actually really, really helps with everything, long-term, obviously. And like, we need to get beyond that kind of short-term mindset of like, oh, what can I do in the next 90 days, or what can I do in the next month or whatever. We need to get into that mindset of like, how can we best set ourselves up for the rest of our lives? Like you used that analogy earlier on where, like, a lawyer or a doctor or whatever will use or will effectively have the first few years of their career as that, eat shit time. It's like, you have to do more work and you get paid fuck all for it, but you end up with a better career, a better like monetary income, etc., as a result of that, longer term. So that is something that a lot of, again, doctors, lawyers, etc., have to do. Like most people in their career, like they start off on a shit salary and then they get to a better salary. So that is something that they do. And if you can kind of think of that in the same way, or use that mindset in the same way of how you view your dieting phase, is like, yeah, you kind of have to eat shit for a while. Not actually, but you kind of have to eat shit for a while, and you're not going to feel at your best. But if you do it correctly, you only have to do this once. Like a lawyer is not doing this multiple times. It's not every year they're like, oh yeah, look, I have to do this again. I have to eat shit and I have to, start out from the bottom of the fucking rung, bottom of the ladder. Like, they're not doing that every single year. So don't do that to yourself. Like, that's the worst outcome that you could get. So get it. So it's like, you do this once, you set yourself up for the rest of your life, and you're actually climbing that ladder rather than putting your foot on the first rung of that ladder every single year. And this is also just further to that. Like, a lot of people make out dieting to be extremely hard, and doesn't need to be that way, right? First of all, you could have terrible diet practices, and that's why you find dieting hard. And that is probably responsible for 70% of why people say dieting is hard. It's just really, really bad diet practices. And then 20% of that is just because dieting is relatively hard. It's like, there are, like, your physiology is going against you, psychology is going against you to some extent, right? And then that last 10% is probably because people use drugs for dieting, right? Like you see bodybuilders all the time saying like, oh, like, when I'm dieting to really low body fat levels, it's like I feel like crap and like I'm a terrible person to be around, and I'm snappy at everyone, blah blah blah. And like they make it out as a joke, and it's like, oh, this is just part of dieting. Now realistically, it's because they're on trend. Like that's the reason for it. I know everyone uses trend as the vehicle for whatever, in terms of, you talk about steroids in the industry, people say, oh, it's trend, but I mean like actual trend. That's what they're on, and that leads to a lot of, we'll call it crankiness. They feel real paranoid, they feel like shit, and that is why most people, again, bodybuilders I'm talking about here, say like, oh, dieting is really hard. It's because they're on trend. Like, yeah, they get better results, but mentally, like, their feelings are all over the place, right? So you have to listen to the right people when you're talking about this stuff, and you have to not have shit diet practices, in terms of you're not going into this like 1,000-calorie deficit and trying to sustain that for the next 16 weeks. Like, it's not going to happen. No one does that, right? So you have to have better diet practices, and then you only have to deal with that 20% of the diet being hard, because you're in a deficit and dieting is relatively hard.
Yeah. So I will let you close us out, Paddy, because I have to go and answer my door here. I have a guest. And other than that, guys, thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.
I have nothing else to say, Gary. You don't need me to close it out. Everyone knows where they can find us. All the links are in the bottom. So I have nothing else to say. Enjoy the rest of your week, guys.
До свидания.